Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We are so thrilled to have you here. I'm Dr. Elise Stevenson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at the ANU. Before we get started tonight, I'd like to start with the acknowledgement of country, acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we're meeting on here today and running this event, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and acknowledging elders past and present, and also paying my respect to all First Nations people who might be joining us here this evening. Acknowledging Australia's own complex history when it comes to conflict, as well as the role of women in our peace processes, is, I think, a really important place to start here this evening as we mark this occasion. We are here to mark the 25th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. So this landmark resolution recognised the vital role of women in peace and conflict prevention, in peace building and in post-conflict resolution and recovery. Now, while we've seen progress, and we have seen progress over this last quarter decade, there is still so much more work to be done to ensure that women's full and meaningful participation is actually happening in peace processes and across the security spectrum. Tonight's event is hosted by the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at the ANU, or GIWL as we like to call ourselves. And we're also in proud partnership with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. GIWL has been founded and is chaired by our first and only female to date Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, who you will hear from in a little bit. And we are a research institute that is dedicated to interdisciplinary research on all manner of intersectional gender equality issues, including across peace, national security and international affairs. Tonight, we're here as conveners to reflect on our region's contributions to the WPS agenda, to celebrate the legacy of 1325 and to explore the future of inclusive peace building, which I think is more important than ever in this current geopolitical climate. We are joined by an extraordinary group of speakers, women who have shaped peace processes, who have been on the very front lines, those who have advanced human rights both here in Australia and overseas, and those who have led transformative change across our region and beyond. I'd like to extend a heartfelt thanks to our panellists, who I'll introduce shortly, Lillian Fan, Sharon Bhagwan-Rolls, and Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer, as well as to our new Ambassador for Gender Equality, Michelle O'Byrne, who will be offering our closing reflections tonight. We're also honoured to share pre-recorded remarks from the Honourable Julia Gillard, as well as Senator the Honourable Penny Wong, reflecting on the history of the WPS agenda, as well as its future directions. So thank you to our partners at DFAT for your support in making this event possible, and to everyone here tonight, researchers, policymakers, peace builders and advocates, for your commitment to advancing gender equality and gender transformative peace and security across our region. Let's begin by hearing from the Honourable Julia Gillard.
Good evening. It is a privilege to welcome you all here tonight for this event, which marks the 25-year anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. While I'm recording this message from elsewhere, I acknowledge that tonight you are meeting on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. 25 years ago, on the 31st of October 2000, the United Nations Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 1325, marking an historic shift in global peace and security discourse. For the first time, the international community formally recognised that women's participation is not peripheral, it is central to building peace and sustaining it. Resolution 1325 acknowledged the unique and disproportionate impacts of conflict on women and girls and called for their full inclusion in peace building, conflict prevention and recovery efforts. Today, as we gather to mark this milestone, we do so in a world where conflict is escalating and the promise of the Women, Peace and Security agenda remains unfulfilled. Armed conflict is now at its highest level since World War II, with over 676 million women living within 50 kilometres of violence. Women and girls continue to face displacement, sexual violence, food insecurity, and the erosion of basic rights. Yet their voices remain underrepresented in peace processes, security institutions, and decision-making forums. And alarmingly, in some places, progress on gender equality is not only stagnating but reversing. Harmful content on social media platforms is helping to drive a backlash against feminism and the growth of misogynistic and retrograde ideas about the roles of men and women. The WPS Index, a global index that ranks countries based on women's inclusion, justice and security, covering 177 countries and economies, shows little movement since its first publication in 2017. Women remain significantly underrepresented in peace and security roles. Just 13% of defence ministers, under 10% of peacekeepers, and only 24% of ambassadors are women. Gender provisions in peace agreements have declined, and while many countries have adopted WPS action plans, nearly a third have lapsed without renewal. Women working on peace and security, particularly those who are displaced, migrant, or from marginalised communities, face increasing risks to their safety and security, both offline and online. Funding remains a major obstacle. Less than 1% of aid reaches women's organisations in conflict zones. And yet, there is hope. Some of the greatest gains in WPS indicators have come from fragile and conflict-affected states, proof that progress is possible, even in the most difficult contexts. When women lead, when civil society mobilises, and when governments commit, change happens. We know that women's well-being is tied to the well-being of nations. Countries that invest in women's inclusion, justice and security are more peaceful, stable, resilient and prosperous. The WPS agenda must be more than a promise. It must be a lived reality for every woman and girl in every community affected by conflict and crisis. We must move beyond symbolic commitments to tangible action that is inclusive, intersectional and adequately resourced. I would like to thank both the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at ANU and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for bringing together some incredible speakers who are demonstrating what tangible action for WPS really looks like. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy this critical and engaging discussion.
I think that is a very compelling way to start. I might ask our speakers to please come up here and join me on the stage. Tonight we are very lucky. We have people who truly have been working on the front lines of peace mediation, of conflict resolution and of human rights all across our region. And I think I wanted to start with a little bit of a warm-up and hear from our speakers themselves. It's much better than me reading out their CVs. So I think I'm going to ask our speakers, and I might start with you, Lillian, to tell us a little bit about what brought you to the Women, Peace and Security agenda and your work, just briefly in 1 to 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, it's a real honour to be here, and it's been a wonderful, short but very intense 2 days in Canberra. And this is a wonderful opportunity to be here to mark this extremely important anniversary and share a bit about our work. I am part of the Southeast Asia Women Peace Mediators, which is a group of 8 women who have basically quite diverse but very, lived experience really in work that cuts across conflict, mediation, negotiation in conflict and peace agreements, humanitarian response coordination and policy, and work with lived, affected communities, displaced communities, victims of genocide and victims of sexual violence, and have worked basically on past conflicts, ongoing conflicts, and are trying to prevent future conflicts. I have my colleague here, Adelina Kamal, as well, who is another one of the 8, former director of the AHA Center of ASEAN as well. For myself, I started coming into this work actually at a very young age. It was when I was in my last year of undergrad, and I was in New York, studying in New York, and I happened to run into a refugee who was working on trying to bring peace to his community in Aceh, Indonesia, which was faced at that time by a separatist conflict. He was a human rights lawyer, a part-time taxi driver, and a part-time student. And I think it was a fateful encounter. You know, I met him possibly by chance, possibly by fate, and ended up working very closely with him. He ended up becoming one of the first people to try to bridge the dialogue between the Free Aceh movement, which was a separatist movement at the time, and the Aceh government, the Indonesian government in Jakarta. And unfortunately, was killed because of that work. So he was one of the early sort of peace builders. His name was Jafar Sidi Hamzah. And Jafar was killed, and it was a very, sort of traumatizing moment for me, but it was one that made me make a decision. Do I continue to do this work and find a way to do it, or do I stop and just say goodbye to this work, which is too dangerous, too traumatizing, too scary? But I decided I would continue that work and found a way since then, not with Southeast Asian women mediators at the time, but really just trying to find any organic way that I could support, communities affected by peace, understand the situation. That's how I got into it, and then eventually started to professionalize. As I grew up and did a master's looking at the Aceh conflict, went on to work in Aceh when it was possible to go there after the tsunami. Before that, I was working sort of, trying to influence the armed organization to get into a peace process, which they finally did. And another one of our mediators actually is from the Free Aceh movement. She was the only woman to be part of the peace negotiations on the rebel side, in the Free Aceh movement side. That's Shadia Marhaban. So we got into the work this way. Currently, I work a lot on Myanmar. Very complicated conflict over there, and particularly on the issue of the Rohingya, which I've been working for a long time.
Thank you so much, Lillian. Yes, incredible experience you can already see here on this panel. Sharon, your name precedes you. Your work is very well known globally, but also particularly in the region. Could you please tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work around?
Thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge the traditional landowners of where we're meeting, and also acknowledge all the wisdom in the room and, the collective legacy of moving this agenda forward. So I got into the feminist movement in the Pacific through the YWCA, and because I had a very wise mother. Both my parents were very active in terms of social movement, gender justice, but my mother was a little bit more left-wing. Through her, I got to know the stories of the women who had paved the way in terms of, the activism for independence in many of our Pacific countries, including my home country of Fiji. It's been about the building on the legacy of the women who marched in solidarity with our faith leaders, traditional leaders, for nuclear justice, for, when the Pacific was being bombed, and have continued to do that. And women and I particularly want to acknowledge the late Dr. Anne Walker, who played an incredible role in helping the foundation, setting the foundations for the YWCA in Fiji. But it was Anne who, in 2000, as we were wrapping up the work of the Blue Ribbon Peace Vigil after our second coup, sent me a note on 31st October 2000, but it would have been the 1st of November, 31st October, New York time, and said, here's the resolution, it's been passed, now just carry on with the work. And so I think that was really catalytic in terms of also seeing how the role of the movements within the Pacific and how we come together, the key issues in terms of making the linkages between peace, development, human security, etc., that we talk about now were just so critical. But also to me, as someone that comes out of media and broadcasting, the vital role of communications. And so I hope we can unpack that a little bit more today and really talk about what that means when we talk about peace building in practice. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And Sue is a great friend of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership and one of our affiliate researchers, but please tell us a little bit more about yourself.
So I am a human rights lawyer from Coonabarabran in New South Wales. No, No one's been there. That usually gets a laugh. My journey started with really being confronted by the freedom rides as a kid that came through Coonabarabran, led by Charlie Perkins. And also, of course, David Bowie chose Coonabarabran as the most racist place on earth to film Let's Dance, the film clip. That was a bit of an awakening about human rights, racism and the situation of First Nations people in my hometown. So when I got to uni, I was very interested in human rights and international law, as all women from Coonabarabran are, of course. And I made a beeline for the DFAT legal team as a grad and for a person who was here in Canberra called Hilary Charlesworth, who was like everything I wanted to be, still is. And I went straight into an organisation called the Australian Council for International Development, which is a peak body for all the aid organisations, development organisations. And I was a human rights person at the time that Timor was really facing complete destruction, so the end of 99, early 2000. So at the time that the Women, Peace and Security Resolution was being passed, I was thinking very hard about this idea of the disproportionate impact of conflict on women in very up-close and personal terms. Dili was still really smouldering when the Australian aid agencies first started trying to assist, but there'd been a long solidarity campaign before that. And I guess that idea of thinking about the way armed conflict affects people in a really three-dimensional way, lack of healthcare, all the things that happen to people in conflict, the way it destroys economies, the way it destroys ecosystems. I guess I saw it in this kind of extraordinarily heartbreaking way in Timor. And I then wrote my PhD on Timor-Leste's, the women of Timor-Leste's experiences of the post-conflict period. So I was always involved in kind of various doomed Australian social justice campaigns with Barb and many others here. And, so after Justice for Timor, it was all about this Women, Peace and Security. They passed it. I'm going to shock the young women here, but for a long time, there was also not clarity about whether rape was a war crime, right? So the first thing I did in 1994 in DFAT was a brief on why rape should be considered a war crime. I mean, it's unthinkable now, but that's where we were. And so there has been a lot of change. So with Timor was also a lot of work on the International Criminal Court and things like that. So I feel like there's all kinds of ways you can contribute to the Women, Peace and Security agenda through direct action, through the type of civil society movement building that Sharon does. There's also a role for thought leadership and for advocacy within your domestic jurisdiction. So I feel like between us, or we've done all of it at one point or another, but it's been a slog, such a slog. Before this passed in 2000, there was 25 odd years of advocacy to get it there. So I think one of the things we should talk about tonight is the longue durée for some of this activism.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Sue. I think you hit on so many good points there. And even, we heard from Julia, we heard from our brilliant panellists already, just the significance. And I think, for those of you not so familiar, we're looking at 9 subsequent resolutions. As Sue mentioned, kind of that landmark kind of definition of rape as a weapon of war, not just a byproduct of war. And all these cross-cutting and emerging issues that intersect with conflict, climate change, violent extremism, looking at, different emerging crises and how they intersect. I think it's really timely. So I guess I want to start with, what does it actually mean to get to the 25-year mark? What does this milestone mean for you personally and professionally? And Sue, I might jump to you first, seeing as you were last to speak.
Oof. So when the Women, Peace and Security Resolution was finally passed at the UN, and it was unanimous and it was a very exciting moment, then the pressure was on in domestic jurisdictions and national jurisdictions to have national action plans. So, we basically tried quite hard for, when was the first one? 12 years. I think it took us 12 years to get the first national action plan. And that was really because Australia was trying to be elected to the Security Council. We took our moment, we took our chances, we rolled our dice, and we got there. We got the first national action plan. But, until then, it was a series of You know, there were resolutions passing that Australia was supporting, but we didn't have that domestic implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And we didn't really have proper gender training before people were being posted. Before peacekeepers were going into places. And really the difference I've seen over the last 25 years has been that institutionalisation. It's not always perfect and it ebbs and flows. Without a plan, you're nowhere, right? So the first National Action Plan was a huge breakthrough, and the second National Action Plan is even better and had more resources. And, you know, now that we've got comparative National Action Plans all over the world, you can compare and look at best practice and put pressure on your government as to, you know, look what Canada's doing. It's always usually Canada. And, you know, and you can also then show real solidarity supporting the Pacific with their National Action Plan, with their ASEAN WPS National Action Plan. It's been a catalytic point of reference for us to be able to have those sorts of conversations.
What about for you, Sharon? So we're a quarter of a decade into WPS. What does it mean personally and professionally?
I'll start by saying at the end of the Pacific Forum Leaders meeting this year, I got back home from Honiara and I was really exhausted, and I felt like I had travelled around the world. And Honiara is not that far from Fiji, from Suva. But I realised that it was 25 years of work in getting this small word, peace, in the Ocean of Peace Declaration. You know, we finally have it in the Pacific Islands Forum Leaders as a declaration, plenipotentiary, it's there. There's language of women and girls in all their diversities. There's a commitment to intergenerational, peace building and engagement. There's a commitment to learning about and using our tradition and customs as Pacific Island people. It talks about the legacy of the nuclear testing. It talks about the impact of climate and the importance of our oceans. So all of that is sitting there in this declaration. And I think I had to sleep for another 3 days because you suddenly go, it's there. So that, and the reason you do that is because it's about the future. It's the work that is being, intentionally intersectional, particularly I think in the last 10 years. There's a lot of learning, what we learned in trying to get in the work to draft and get the regional action plan adopted, and the learning of its non-implementation, and why we persist in engaging with the Pacific Islands Forum as a key intergovernmental organization. So all of that work, very intentional. The intersectionality as well, because it's our experience of TC-PAM in 2015 and that opportunity to suddenly leverage climate into the WPS discourse that got us climate change into 2242. And the intergenerational work is really about thinking, how do we now build that capacity for younger women to continue to engage and learn and participate in peace building and in the political work, in the political agency that they can claim, whether it's in their communities, whether it's in their countries, whether it's through the Pacific Islands Forum. So it's all of that. It's also, continuing to amplify the call that we still have to deal with self-determination and decolonization in our region. We still have to consider a strong denuclear peace and a demilitarized peace. And how do we also work to be able to ensure that we don't have this sporadic funding, but actually dedicated peace building funding that comes through civil society and actually can the WPS agenda is there to leverage women's leadership into peace building. It's not just women sitting on the side and doing women's peace. We are weaving a strong mat, but in that mat, we're bringing in the male leaders, the faith leaders, the traditional leaders, our sons, our brothers, our grandsons. So yeah, it's all of that. So for me, the WPS agenda has gone from meaning, yay, let's celebrate the Security Council resolution, but now actually, how do we hold the multilateral system more in a way that addresses the unfinished business of the 25 years? So 25 years of work is great. we're all a lot wiser and a bit more grey hair. But yeah, looking to the future, it is about, just learning from all of that and steering it into a place where younger women can really pick it up and go with it without having to feel like, oh, there's so many blockages. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. I'm pretty keen to talk about some of those blockages a little bit further on. But what about for you, Lillian? From your kind of standpoint, what's this 25 years mean to you?
So I think it's a bit different when it comes to Southeast Asia for several reasons, right? One is that Southeast Asia and South Asia are full of subnational conflicts, right? And most of the conflicts that we have in the region are subnational. It's a separatist organization here that has, is from an ethnic group which has a long sovereignty, pre-colonial, and, is not happy with the current form of nation state and wants independence or wants autonomy. There are lots and lots of examples of that. And there was a study by the Asia Foundation in 2013, which actually counted about 26 subnational conflicts across Southeast Asia and South Asia. And there's many more. And, the one context that I work on a lot now is Myanmar. Just within Myanmar, there are at least, 35 to 38, ethnic armed organizations which are active. There are others which are not active at the moment. So I've gone into some form of ceasefire with the military. But it's, they're all looking for a form of autonomy. I think that there's been the reality of conflict and the reality of, a lot of conflicts that have simmered, some conflicts that have really exploded, some that are, have evolved. The Myanmar one, for example, it didn't start in 2021. I mean, there is a new form of resistance that exploded in 2021, which is the post-coup revolution, which is much wider, much more urban, much more comprehensive across the country. But a lot of the conflicts, the armed conflicts, have been in existence, and those struggles have been in existence since independence of Myanmar. So a lot of it goes back to colonial history, a lot of it goes back to how borders were drawn, a lot of it goes back to how sovereignty was defined. And I think, it's not just 25 years, right? I mean, these are contexts in which there have been so much contestation, so much kind of, really debate over definitions of sovereignty, who's in control of what, and actual armed, conflict that has taken place. And a lot of, initiatives to sort of, either contain, crush, negotiate, that have actually happened outside any understanding of WPS, right? So I think that it's actually been almost a parallel process, and now our countries, have finally all signed on to a regional plan of action for WPS. It only happened a few years ago. It's been a very slow rollout. Officially, ASEAN has been very reluctant to officially talk of conflict, right? We have really struggled to bring the language of conflict into our formal discussions until recently, and we still don't have a proper sort of conflict mechanism in terms of conflict response. We have a humanitarian coordination body. Adelina used to be the executive director of that body, but it's designed for disaster response, natural disaster response, not designed for conflict. There isn't really a very comprehensive sort of, conflict response mechanism. So the WPS work has been a bit detached from an actual operational, mechanism to be able to work and contain conflict and do mediation. However, that has also allowed for a lot of innovation in the region. So because of that, number one, the people who are really carrying out the work of, inclusivity in negotiations and peace building at the grassroots level are communities, and it includes a lot of women. But it's also youth, it's also, traditional leaders, it's people who are on the front lines who have to hold the communities together and have to do everything, become, the negotiator for ceasefires as well as the person, negotiating for humanitarian access and, so on and so forth. But at the state level, it's usually been a very asymmetrical power dynamic. And usually the states don't really want outside intervention on these issues, right? They would really sort of, try to manage it on their own until it gets to the point where they can't manage it on their own. And then, we've had, actually it's a very unique region because it's probably one of the few regions where you have two peace processes which have actually been signed and have held for quite a long time, right? So this is, the anniversary of WPS, but it's also the 20th anniversary this year of the Aceh peace process The Aceh peace process, the Memorandum of Understanding, which was signed in Helsinki, that was exactly 20 years ago, right? It was in 2005, almost a year after the Indian Ocean tsunami. And then for Mindanao, the Bangsamoro peace process, that's been 11 years now. So these are two peace processes where there was a level of outside mediation. Definitely, Mindanao had sort of a design and an architecture which brought in the international community, but regional as well, regional ceasefire monitors, a Malaysian facilitator, right, from the Malaysian government, but also a contact group which brought in a lot of the other states. There were lots of failed processes before, unfortunately, one attempt after another, and it wasn't the right time, it wasn't the right mechanism, it wasn't the right design. Finally, after the tsunami, both sides decided that this is enough, let's get serious about this, and Finland stepped in with, the late President Martti Ahtisaari, managed to negotiate the process, an actual peace process, which has held. And it doesn't get rid of the political issues, but it has held. Both of those processes had remarkable women involved in negotiations, both of whom are actually part of Southeast Asia Women Peace Mediators. Shadia Marhaban, who I've mentioned, who was the negotiator for the Free Aceh movement. She was the only woman in the room for the negotiation in Helsinki. And Professor Miriam Ferrer, who is also our colleague, who basically was the first woman in the world to sign a peace agreement from the government side. And she signed the peace agreement she was the chief negotiator for the Bangsamoro process for the Philippines government. So it has been very remarkable in the sense that you've had these opportunities, there have been women in the room in certain things, but it hasn't really been by design. It hasn't been like started with the institution, started with everyone signing up to WPS. A lot of it was, let us do something about these conflicts. Let's try every way possible. Let's find a way that we get these things to work. And then I think a lot of it was communities who were in the conflicts realized, and the governments who were in conflicts realized, it's not just about adding a woman because we've signed on to 1325. It's about how the hell are we going to get this conflict solved and address those issues? Excuse my French, but that's actually the reality of it.
Oh, and you absolutely hit on the data. We know from global data that, when you involve women in peace processes, they are much more likely to gain consensus, to last longer, be more effective for communities. I mean, we're talking about real, tangible outcomes for economies, but also for society. And I think that's so critical. This isn't a nice to have. It's not just about representation at the table. This is like real, tangible impact on so many different levels. And I mean, I guess women, peace and security, there's so many ways you can kind of cut the cake, if you will, in terms of the amount of how you can address it. I mean, a lot of my research has looked at women's representation in our, in our diplomacy, our defence, in our institutions who are doing a lot of this work, because that remains really important, and it remains important for nations like Australia to role model best practice wherever we can. But then there's also reducing sexual violence. For you, Lillian, I'm really interested, what does it look like for women peace builders in Southeast Asia? What are those big challenges? What is the reality of what they are facing right now? Can you walk us through, I guess, what it's like on the ground?
Yeah, I'll talk specifically about, about Myanmar, and particularly about the Rohingya, right? Because I think that's a conflict which gets so forgotten. And it gets forgotten especially from a conflict perspective, not so much a humanitarian perspective. We all think about the Rohingya as a big humanitarian crisis, and Australia is really supporting in terms of stepping up on humanitarian aid in Cox's Bazar as well. But it's a political issue, right? And the whole of Myanmar is facing an enormous political crisis. The conflicts are political issues. These conflicts are about, negotiating, for new arrangements on sovereignty. And women are at the forefront of rebuilding or building a new Myanmar, right? So if you look at the National Unity Government, the foreign minister is a brilliant woman, right? Do Sin Maong, very brave revolutionaries, right? And a lot of these are women who've been not just sort of, new on the scene, but women who've been struggling against military dictatorship for years and years and years. Many of them are former political prisoners. And the ones who are leaders in ethnic groups, right, in the ethnic resistance organizations, they've already built systems on the ground in their territories which are delivering because they don't expect, the military system to deliver for them, and it hasn't delivered for them for decades. So you're really talking about, not just one set of peace builders. You're talking about people who are, and not just peace, but revolution and peace, right? They want revolution first, justice, and then peace. But it's a whole political movement. For the Rohingya, it's a little bit different because, number one, they're victims of genocide, and number two, they're stateless. There's been very little recognition. But part of the reason why it's so important to now bring in Rohingya, not just women, but women and men and youth and everybody in the Rohingya community into a political dialogue and recognize their political agency is precisely because that's what made them invisible, right? The lack of political agency, not being granted political agency, not having a seat at any table, having their voices erased, having their names erased, having their entire identity erased. And that is something I think where, the politics of that is, how do you solve that issue of political invisibility? It's by making them visible, insisting that they're at the table, insisting on their agency, doing what we can to support that. The Rohingya are incredible. I mean, I've worked so much with them, and I have to say one of the most inspiring communities that I've ever worked with, who have had so much taken away from them, but, have been able to do so much with whatever little they've been able to be given. And they're not looking for more aid. Of course, they need the aid. I'm not saying don't increase the aid. Definitely they need the aid to survive, but it's more than survival, right? What they really need is to have that voice. So I think that, the struggle looks different for different people. In other places in Southeast Asia, it's about, our newest member, Timor-Leste, that is such a celebration. This is something that just happened. We're so, so proud. I think the best moment in our ASEAN summit just a few days ago in Kuala Lumpur, our Timor-Leste is finally our 11th member in ASEAN, but so much that we can learn from there and so much that we can support. We are continuing to support the work there. One of our mediators, Tekla, is from Timor. She's done incredible work there. Adelina is supporting that work as well, and we're working on the reconciliation process, right? So it's also that looking at the different spectrum of where you are in a conflict. Are you at the stage where you're literally surviving genocide and trying to get a voice back into your community and finding a way to build alliances with other ethnic groups so you can get recognition and citizenship and, recognition as a citizen who deserves to live in that society. That is the Rohingya struggle, all the way to the Timorese, context now where we're looking at deepening reconciliation, and not just with Indonesia, but actually within the Timorese community, right? Those who were pro-independence and those with pro-autonomy. There's a whole range of contexts and realities.
No, thank you so much, Lillian. And I think one thing that really struck me there and that I think is really important for us to pick up on, and I might go to you, Sharon, to partially answer this, but I guess this differentiation between peace and justice also, and I think this being really, really important to get to, and also the reality of how did we get here in the first place, right? I think that there's a gendered pattern to conflict and war also, and the decisions that are made, who decides what we do that leads us down some of these incredibly damaging pathways for society. But Sharon, I'd really like to hear from you. I guess the Pacific has shown really remarkable leadership in this space, and I really want to know from you more about how peacebuilders are responding to some of the crises that you're facing, whether that's climate or otherwise, but also what does justice look like for you or for your region?
You can't avoid talking about peace and justice without talking about climate change. It's all connected, both in terms of our climate and our environment. So that's really something that encompasses everything that we do more and more now. But I think also in terms of justice, it's justice at the micro level, which is about the reconciliation within communities. We've had political crises, for example, in my own country in Fiji, and it doesn't mean just because you've gone to elections that relationships have been restored, whether it's relationships with state institutions or relationships between communities, the ethnic communities, the differences between ethnic communities, as well as within the communities, right? So none of us are homogenized, right? So it's that. So I think there's that justice at that very personal level, and making sure, particularly in Fiji right now, that there is a truth and reconciliation process. What does that really look like in the context of gender justice? So you can't just simply talk about justice in that kind of legal human rights space. That's important accountability. But if we're striving for gender justice, what is that process looking like including the support for healing, etc., right? So that's in one place, and you could probably talk about that a little bit more in the context within the Melanesian sub-regional group, whether we're talking about the healing and restoration of relationships within Solomon Islands, between the provinces, etc. And what does that look like? Because when we had a learning exchange recently with some of the younger women of the Solomon Islands Young Women's Parliamentary Group, and we were going back and saying, okay, what does peace look like for you? For the younger women, it was actually about going back to the root causes of some of the conflicts and the crises that they have faced. So not just the big conflict, the big crisis, but also the more recent ones in terms of why do we have these political riots? Why was there burning? And we have similar questions. In Bougainville, I think it's a lot more complex. And in terms of the women that we work with from West Papua and those still in the struggle for self-determination, whether it's in Kanaki or Mahui Nui, that justice also means the right to have political autonomy. If we look at up in the Northern Pacific, our sisters in Marshall Islands talk a lot about, the humanitarian impact of the nuclear testing. And so what is nuclear justice, or what does justice look like when for generations your health is being impacted? You don't know whether in your low-lying atolls your water is safe to drink. And when the cancers are growing within the generations as well. So justice, I think, is more than just that humanitarian framework. And then to come to the climate justice agenda, it's really that linkage between when we talk about climate security, it's not just in the sense of traditional security. It's really about being able to still remain within our communities where we are connected to our environment, to our oceans, to our rivers, to the trees, to everything that we identify with in our traditions and customs, and making sure it's there for the next generation. So it's climate justice, it's ecological justice as well. So I think to come back to how it's all connected, when we come together as women peace builders, it allows us to sit down and have those conversations about our communities, our countries, our sub-regions, and then our Pacific Island region, because we don't actually have a lot of those conversations when it comes to the political context. And so for me, the WPS agenda first catalyzed that conversation where a few of us were talking about how do we prevent the resurgence of conflict and violence. But it has grown into that cross-movement collaboration where we can talk about the political situation, the militarization, and the climate situation, because you can't just work in silos. We're not bureaucrats, we're peace builders, we're mediating, we're entering into dialogue in so many different ways. So yeah, I think the whole conversation on justice has really shifted. But, like I said, that one of the things that we now have in the Ocean of Peace Declaration is still that accountability to the human rights. So we can't move away from then making those connections with ensuring there's state accountability, and particularly using CEDAW. So I think we actually have to unpack a lot more how to actually use CEDAW in our Pacific Island region in the context of peace and security. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Sharon. And I think maybe speaking of bureaucrats and speaking of policy, I might throw to you, Sue. From this policy and human rights perspective, right? And I think, we are here in Australia. I think it makes sense to ask about what Australia needs to be doing or should be doing, or how we can support not just peace builders in the region, but also the women, peace and security agenda, and I guess shoring it up for the future. I mean, you mentioned this right at the start, right? We've come 25 years already, but we're also at a bit of a precipice and a quite difficult situation, I think. So give us your wisdom, I suppose, on this kind of policy and future perspective.
Well, I must say, in preparing for tonight, I was feeling a fair amount of deep, dark despair, in the sense of, the sort of things exactly that Sharon was just talking about, in terms of making sure our ideas about peace are infused with ecological justice, we seem to be moving further and further away from that at the global level. So about 10 years ago, Russia just started constantly vetoing the idea of climate change as a security threat. So, the Security Council, the permanent members, they get to basically say what goes on the Security Council agenda, and it has to be around the maintenance of peace and security. And they're always saying certain things aren't threats to maintenance of peace and security, organised crime, electoral violence and so forth, and climate change has been over there, and women, peace and security and the rights of youth used to be over there too. That's why until this. So what it meant is that issues around how climate change actually acts as a traditional security threat have really been sort of stifled in the Security Council itself, but not in other parts of the UN and not in national action plans. So about half, less, of the national action plans that now exist mention climate change. Some of them in a more robust way than others, the Pacific the most robust. But really, the thinking is not where we need it to be, in that kind of sophisticated decolonial thinking about violence against women and girls in non-armed conflict situations and the continuum of emergencies to war. So we've got a lot of thinking we still need to do. So the DFAT International Gender Strategy is pretty good. It has an infusion, I think, of that kind of thinking. It could get a little bit more decolonial, but, it's a journey. But it's got the general idea that, we're at a crisis point in terms of our ability of our environment to support human life and the destabilising influence that's going to have on gender relations. So did you all know that essentially because of the impacts of climate change, we've seen this incredible acceleration of forced and early marriage around the world, right? This unbelievable spike in forced and early marriage where precarity and disasters based on climate impacts have basically led to these terrible decisions families make to survive, right? So if you ask the average punter, what's the biggest gendered impact of climate change? You don't think to yourself a huge spike in forced and early marriage. But actually, when you think about it, yes, that's exactly what's going to happen, right? And particularly in Southeast Asia, but also in Africa. That's what we're dealing with, these hyperlinked, difficult, complex, wicked problems. The other big issue that I've been thinking about a lot is the kind of gendered impact of all these extreme heat events around the world and what they are going to mean for the experience of being pregnant, for the experience of being elderly. The majority of people who died from the European heat waves were elderly women over 80 who lived alone. We've got some serious things to think about, and we seem to not be able to hold more than one thing in our head at a time, right? So it's really important that we start thinking about the women, peace and security agenda in a way that's quite different to the way we used to think about it. When we first thought about women, peace and security, it was really about we need more gender advisors in peacekeeping teams, and we need more women, in militaries, and more gender advisors, and this sort of thing. It was a very add women and stir, and it was all this idea that militaries would just be a lot better if there were more women in them, which I think it was kind of magical thinking as well. And then it got to be more about let's look at the causes of armed conflict and, some of the gendered causes of armed conflict, which is what Elise is talking about. And we're getting a little bit more sophisticated in that thinking. And there's nothing new about that. That was in the Beijing Platform for Action. That's from, Liz Estrada, right? That's ancient thinking about gender and conflict. But we need to do something. But I really thought we'd crossed certain lines. So when we've been looking at all these subsequent resolutions around 1325, I really thought we got to the stage where we wouldn't have a peace agreement process with all male protagonists anymore. I thought that's gone the way of the dodo. But no, Israel-Palestine, ceasefire agreement, all males, all, as if, women aren't involved in and of course the Taliban negotiations and all sorts of things. So we keep finding these lines that are actually regressing. Anyway, so Australia has come a long way in the way that it thinks about women, peace and security, and the newest National Action Plan is a pretty sophisticated piece of thinking. But at the same time, our closest ally has just completely pulled the pin on not just the women, peace and security support that it used to have in the UN, but also all the underlying infrastructure, you know, the Global Office for Women's Issues in the State Department, practically the whole State Department, and the US aid program, right? So it's having huge ramifications for countries like Australia. And we have to be principled, but also think about how we're going to support our Pacific neighbours in particularly, in how to think about funding and strategy. We can't fill the void that the US has left, but we can at least be principled and show solidarity around the way we still think about diversity, inclusion, women, peace and security, climate change, all of those issues. Yeah, so it's not great. I'm not going to lie to you. It's not great at the moment. It's not great in the UN, and it's not great for Australia in terms of its ability to deal with its closest ally in this space. So there's a lot of storms to weather.
There's a lot of storms to weather. And I think the kind of message we're getting from the panel so far is also around this increasing, I guess, complexity and nuance needed, and I think a real re-strengthening and getting, you know, to the principles of this, you know, beyond any women, peace and security agenda, you know, officially named, you know, the principles underlying what it means are really quite basic principles that we need to be embedding everywhere. And I think, you know, just thinking about some of the nuances and differences and how WPS might be playing out, it always, you know, those of you who have been to other events I've spoken at, you might be sick of this story already. But it always, you know, struck me when I was part of Women, Peace and Security Coalition workshops a number of years ago, and we were discussing peace and security, you know, all across the world, and, you know, Myanmar and Afghanistan and all of these distinct cases, and what could Australia be doing more of. And then, you know, this young woman pipes up at the end and is, hey, is anyone available to walk me to my car? I don't feel safe getting there. And you really have to unpack this idea of what actually is peace and security, and is it something that always happens over there, or is there more reflection that we should be doing here in Australia also in terms of our own kind of histories, but also contemporary? I think that this is something that I would personally like to see a little bit more done here. We're going to go to questions in 3 minutes. So audience, please prime your questions, which means I'm going to give our panellists rapid fire. Give me 1 minute as we reflect on 25 years of UNSCR 1325. What gives you hope for the next 25? So 1 minute each. Sue, rapid fire, over to you.
Well, as I said, Australia's trying to get back on the Security Council, so there's always room to move when that happens. But mostly what gives me hope are young activists, you know, always. Just, I feel like they're more sophisticated, they're more better at working in solidarity with other women around the world, they're more intersectional, they're more open-minded about strategy, they're more willing to forget government, do their own thing, which is very refreshing. Yeah, so I feel there's a lot of reverse mentoring going on in the movement at the moment.
Brilliant. Sharon, over to you.
The fact that what gives me hope is the fact that we continue to persist for peace, you know, and that we're not losing sight of the peace building, whether it is in the local context or across nations or, you know, at the intergovernmental or multilateral level. And where there is hope also is in that cross-movement work, because we can't silo. We can't just talk about participation over here and prevention over there and protection and, oh, then there's relief and recovery. So we actually bring it all together. So for me, that's the hope, that the cross-movement work, the intersectionality, and then, of course, the intergenerational work, because we have to keep it moving, but we also have to build on the legacy.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think we've got a good intergenerational audience here today, hopefully, who can help move that forwards. Lillian, what's your message of hope?
I mean, I think for me, what I've seen doing this work, and I think particularly in the last, 5 years that we've come together as Southeast Asia women peace mediators, is just how much willingness there's been in the region to engage and open doors and work with us, maybe because we were working on issues that there wasn't really an official sort of precedent for, and it was a bit controversial for people. It was a bit something that nobody really wanted to talk about. And we work very confidentially. Like we're not exactly an advocacy organization. We're much more of a, actual mediators going out and doing the mediation, and each one working on a particular conflict and bringing in partners, particularly government, non-government, peacebuilders, cutting across. And I think the willingness of so many of those partners, whether it's communities, whether it's governments, who've been maybe struggling to connect those levels, who have been really willing to give us that trust to, work with us and enable us to play that role of bringing them together. Because it's not us who's going to solve the conflict, but, you can bring people together and help move things along. So I think the trust that's been given to us, I've served this year advising the ASEAN Special Envoy on Myanmar, and in a very kind of quiet, confidential, backstopping role, advisory and technical advice. And that's just such a privilege to be able to be given that level of confidence. So I think the trust that's been given to us has been tremendous and, not something we take for granted.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for sharing. For our audience, now we're going to hand over to you, and I think we've got 2 roving mics around up the front. So if you've got a question, please do raise your hand, and I think we might just start down here in the middle with Jane. Thank you. Then right up the back there, if the second mic could go up there.
Thank you so much. Is this on? Yes. And panel, that's brilliant and very inspiring. And thank you for tonight's event. I'm hearing that we still have to capture hearts and minds globally, here at home, in the UN, and around the world where there are these conflicts which impact so badly. I feel that language is important. Of course, I'm a bit of a language person, but words are very important. Language and the concepts behind them, the way you can bring a population along, as first, second and third wave feminism did, as the climate change activists did, as the Pacific Islands did. I feel that we need to win hearts and minds. And my question to each of the panellists is, what is the key message that you could encapsulate, which we need to get through to the general public, who in turn, in democratic societies at least, will put pressure on those with power and influence?
Excellent. Panel, I think, take the floor if you want to answer.
Just for an Australian audience, it's about our place in this region. We have to invest in peace. We have to. So most of my conversations with DFAT go along the lines of, how much are we spending on AUKUS and we don't have a conflict and mediation unit inside DFAT? This is ridiculous. We have to be using our resources to invest in peace, actively invest in peace. Where is our conflict resolution team inside DFAT? Where is that expertise? We have to have it, and we currently don't. And if we were taking the women, peace and security work seriously, we would be investing in that. Sometimes we invest in other countries' conflict and mediation skills, but not our own. It's madness. So that would be the first thing I'd say. You have to invest in peace. It doesn't just happen, it's a skill. Conflict resolution is skilled work. Conflict prevention is skilled work, and we need to invest in it.
Reminds me, diplomacy is our first line of defence. Over to you, Sharon.
I think in the same vein, it's actually about, in terms of communicating with the general public, asking them to really talk about what does peace mean to them. And that's when we get to the root causes of some of the inequalities, the drivers of conflicts, whether it's in the home or things that spiral out. And we see it in local conflicts or what become national and political crises as well. That's one. The other thing is then communicating that back through the development paradigm, because if we don't have equality in development, including gender equality, where people don't have access to clean water, where they're not participating in decision making, when they're seeing the encroaching of rising sea levels, but not actually being part of the decision making about what happens to my community and the acknowledgement of the loss and damage that is done, but it's not economic loss and damage. I think all of that is really, like I said earlier, about participation. So it comes back to how people can actually also talk about how they want to be part of not just defining peace, but building peace, and what does that look like. and being free to be able to do that as well, free and safety to organize, to speak in what should be those democratic spaces. Yeah.
I mean, I think for Southeast Asia, I would say it's a little bit different. I mean, there's certainly a lot of resonance with the messages, I think, for the Australian public. But for Southeast Asia, I feel like we've had such a history and we're so used to sort of externalizing this discussion on conflict. And even now, even though there's more talk about, the global order and, obviously everyone's been watching, the horrors of Gaza on television and all of this, but still, we still tend to think of it as something that's happening out there that somebody else is going to solve. And, we all like to become the audience now, having everybody's a commentator on things. But it's still a little bit removed, right? It's still not something that people are internalizing in terms of, what are they doing in their everyday lives or in their attitudes or in their perspectives of, breaking down those barriers, looking at the reality, the lived reality of somebody else, bringing that level of, fundamental equality to somebody who may be a refugee living in your community, who may have gone through horrors of genocide, sexual violence, and everything else, but has real knowledge about how to negotiate for, protection of your community and access to fundamental security and fundamental, humanitarian assistance and all of those things. There's, I think, a lot that needs to be done to unpack that and give respect to people who've lived through conflict. That is the first thing. We live in a region where, you live in Malaysia and we're surrounded by not just people, who are Malaysian citizens, we're surrounded by refugees from Myanmar. We have a lot of Afghan refugees in our community. We have Palestinians too, and not as many as you would think. 7 ethnic nationalities who have sought asylum, not asylum in Malaysia, but are there in Malaysia, as refugees, mainly with UNHCR cards. These are all victims and survivors, and they have real knowledge. We don't even have a conversation about them yet, and that, I think, is mirrored in many parts of Southeast Asia. Cambodia is a bit different. They've got the memorialization, right, of genocide, but I think still, you look at now, there's this conflict happening with Thailand, and I think it's also about learning those lessons, right? Like, how do you de-escalate when you need to de-escalate? How do you make sure you're not contributing to conflict? There are all these types of things. And we just don't have a regional language, actually, to talk about it, even in our own respective languages. But there isn't that comfort zone yet of really putting these things out in the public. It's still very much, a little bit hidden in some of, academia and diplomacy and all of that. Activism, obviously, right? Civil society is much more progressive, but still a long way to go on that.
Thank you so much. Going to our questioner right at the back there.
Thank you, Alice. My name is Shelley. I'm a PhD student at GIWL NU, and I'm actually from Aceh, where I live throughout the conflict that you just described, and that's part of my childhood memory. So I would like to thank you for all the work you have done to help make the peace happen in 2005. My question for you, Lillian, based on your long-term engagement in being part of peacebuilding mediators, what lesson can be drawn about integrating gender perspective into peacebuilding and development policies? More specifically, how can policymakers better harness the roles women already play in communities? Thank you.
I think over to you, Lillian.
Great. It's so nice to have a lady in the audience from Aceh. I would say that, Aceh was very interesting, right? Because I think there's so much about Aceh where women have played such a strong role, historically, right? With some of the great heroes of Indonesia and the entire region are Acehnese women, historically. First Admiral, you had the great anti-colonial, warriors, fighting against the Dutch. But at the time of the conflict, women really suffered. I mean, there was so much suffering that took place among Acehnese women. A lot of women obviously lost their husbands. A lot of the husbands went missing. Many of the husbands were accused of being part of the Free Aceh movement. There was a very kind of blanket assumption that, most men in any village, particularly in certain areas, but then the conflict spread, a lot of assumption that these men were all Free Aceh movement and separatists. So a lot of women lost their husbands. A lot of women were widows. There was like entire villages of widows, right? I still remember this in Aceh. A lot of mass graves that were found in Aceh that, women didn't even recognize who was in the grave. You couldn't even know where your husband was. And all that, I think, was one of the reasons why it was so important to have not just, we talk about Shadia. She was, I think, the most visible woman in the negotiations, right? But there was a broader movement of women as well. Many of them are my friends, right? Incredible women who were working at the grassroots level, working at the ground, working in activism, who were all being consulted, actually, a lot of them, by the Free Aceh movement. Also thanks to people like Shadia and some others from civil society who went into the movement and advised them and pulled in those perspectives. So I think that's a great example. Aceh is an example of what can happen when you have a gender perspective, not just from the woman in the room, but from all the men and everyone who's involved in those negotiations, understanding that you need to see things differently, you need to listen to things differently, you need to build in place mechanisms where you actually have consultations with the broader population that's affected by the conflict, right? In the Aceh conflict, when they were negotiating for the Helsinki, MOU, they came to Malaysia several times, and a few of us opened up the universities for them and basically allowed Acehnese, the Free Aceh movement negotiators to have broad meetings with all walks of life, the religious leaders, from representatives from different villages, from a lot of civil society groups, student organizations, humanitarian organizations, and human rights organizations, and all of it, so that they could be held accountable as well to what they're negotiating, right? What are you actually raising in these talks? What are you negotiating for, right? That is a great example, and I was just reflecting on this with Noah, who is one of the other members of the negotiating team, about how that happened. And that doesn't always happen. Now, unfortunately, I'm trying very hard to work on the issue of the Rohingya, right? And trying to get that into a process where there's actually political discussion about the citizenship, the status, the return, and what that's going to look like in the broader Myanmar context. It's very hard to, and there's so many brilliant Rohingya women, by the way, who actually would be great negotiators, mediators, and all of that, not being consulted, right? Just being left out, just being ignored, even a lot of the other men. It's a very kind of, there's a lot of domination by militant groups, right? There's a lot of domination by, groups with a certain perspective. And that's very unhelpful when you don't have those mechanisms built in, and realization, I think, even by a lot of the powerful men. That is important, right? That's really important. So it does make a huge difference.
No, thank you so much. We have time only for one very quick question. So I think right down here at the front, please go for it.
I wanted to ask something that I feel like we haven't really touched on tonight. I mean, first of all, thank you for a wonderful panel discussion. I know we're really talking about celebrating 25 years of 1325, but really only what's been some global backsliding on gender equality and on women, peace and security implementation. It's not just the US where we've seen some of this happening. We've had for the first time, a resolution passed without unanimous support. And we've seen a lot of kind of donor countries across Europe turning to the right, where we once had significant support for this agenda. And I was hoping to get kind of, thoughts and feelings from the panel about some of that. Thanks.
Excellent. And I might just remind our panel, if you can keep your remarks relatively short so that we can get our lovely people to canapes and drinks after this as well. But over to you for some final remarks on that.
Well, just absolutely. I was quite shocked about, some of the most stalwart proponents of WPS have been the Nordics, and they're so focused on, their new membership of NATO and the threat from Russia. It feels like a lot of the kind of precepts of women, peace and security seem to be optional when there's a real threat of conflict. Suddenly it's all back to, none of that is what Hillary calls a decorative frill. It's back to a decorative frill instead of the main game. And I think that it's so short-sighted. It's not an evidence-driven decision in that case, and Europe should know better given its history. But it's also true that Europe and the US did underwrite a lot of the women, peace and security work, funded it, supported it, did a lot of the kind of diplomatic work. And that absence is really being felt. So it's very important for other countries, Canada, Australia, Costa Rica, our wonderful
champion, and various other countries to kind of really step into this space. And it's really important, I think, for ASEAN to step into this space. It's part of ASEAN's test of legitimacy. You know, can it pass the test of Myanmar, you know, after not passing the test to Sri Lanka and, you know, so many other kind of interesting things. And then the Pacific, we cannot ask the Pacific to do any more heavy lifting than it's already doing on climate change, but, you know, the Pacific does need to lead the way that it always has in terms of being a counter narrative on some of these issues, on saying that, you know, we need to be principled, and also that we need the idea of peace to be not always military driven. So the other thing that's exploded in our region is, you know, is defence diplomacy. It's so visible, you know, it's everywhere as a sort of a visible counter to China. And this is not the way to go. It's just this circling pattern of armament and militarisation. And as I think Elizabeth Reed once said, the opposite of feminism is militarisation. So it's something. Was that you? Was it? Oh, okay. I always thought that was you, but it's a good one. We'll say that you said that.
Misquoting from the panel.
It might have been Cynthia and you, actually.
We'll take it, Sue. Sharon, do you want to have the last word?
I mean, I think I want to come back to the whole peace and development nexus, because at the end of the day, if we are concerned about demilitarization, if that's what we want, if we want denuclearization, we need to have the kind of peace and development indicators. And so very pragmatically, Agenda 2030 has that opportunity over the course of the next few years to help us make the connection. We've got gender equality, we've got SDG 16, we've got climate and oceans, and how do we shift the dial in terms of reminding all our heads of state that have signed on and endorsed the SDGs that what is it going to look like over the next 3 years? The Blue Pacific Strategy, which is a bigger vision to 2050, but the progressive markers towards that is about an investment in peace building that is civilian and civil society led, and the women's leadership through all the work that's happening across the movements, including on, you know, making WPS more operational, has to be the way to go, because we've already created those spaces, including with our partners from traditional and faith movements. So I think that's the sort of very pragmatic way I'm thinking right now.
Yeah, I think that we've got more, but I wanted to take a moment just to thank our panel, because I think that was such a rich conversation, and thank you also to the audience for your questions. So we are now going to hear from another of our kind of foremost leaders. We're going to hear from Australia's Foreign Minister, the Honourable Senator Penny Wong, who will reinforce, I guess, our critical need to act right now and tell us a little bit more about Australia's National Action Plan.
It's a privilege to join you virtually to mark 25 years since the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. 25 years since the international community recognised the disproportionate impact of conflict on women and girls, and acknowledged that peace is stronger and more sustainable when women are at the table, shaping the decisions that affect their lives and their communities. 25 years since the UN Security Council unanimously declared that sexual violence and rape must not be used as a weapon of war. It was a landmark moment for the protection of human rights and the rights of women and girls. Yet progress remains incomplete. Today, 600 million women, 15% of women worldwide, live within 50 kilometres of armed conflict zones. UN-verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence surged by 50% in 2023 and by a further 25% in 2024, and almost a third of these cases involved girls. Not only do women and girls bear the greatest costs of conflict, we know that peace agreements are more likely to last when women participate in the negotiation. We know that gender equality reduces poverty, strengthens social cohesion, unlocks economic productivity and enhances prosperity for current and future generations. And if we allow progress on gender equality to be rolled back and undermined, we pay the price of a world that is more dangerous, more divided, less stable and poorer. Australia is committed to a better vision, to the full, equal and meaningful participation and leadership of women in all peace and security processes. Through our second National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, we are working in partnership with regional networks, including the Pacific Women Mediators and the Southeast Asian Women Mediators, who demonstrate every day what inclusive conflict prevention, response and recovery can achieve. We are also delivering on our international gender equality strategy, placing women's leadership at the centre of Australia's foreign policy and national security efforts. Thank you all, and particularly to the Global Institute for Women's Leadership and to Julia Gillard for your tireless leadership in championing women's voices and equality around the world. Tonight, as we celebrate this milestone, let us not only reflect on all that has been achieved, but rededicate ourselves to that vision and remind ourselves that progress is always resisted and our gains must always be protected. Thank you.
We have heard from not one, not two, but many, many phenomenal leaders tonight. And I don't think it's every day that we get to hear such voices as we have here tonight. But it doesn't end there. I'm also really honoured to invite to the stage Michelle O'Byrne, who is Australia's new Ambassador for Gender Equality and no stranger to advancing women's rights, to deliver our closing address. I'll invite you up here now, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I start by acknowledging that we stand on the unceded land of the Ngunnawal people, land that they have loved and cared for over 60,000 years. I have to say I was going to start my comments with the phrase, I thought about it today because I've met these amazing women before and I knew that this was going to be wonderful. I thought the easiest line was I could just come up here and say, yeah, what she said. And that would be okay. That would absolutely be okay because we've heard some incredible things. I'm not sure there's much I can add to it, but I'm going to because that's my job. But can I start by recognising the fact that we do stand on the shoulders of giants? And we've talked about 30 years ago with the commitment in Beijing. We've heard about 25 years ago, and we'll talk a bit more about that. But about 50 odd years ago, maybe a bit more than 50 years ago, there was the first ever woman appointed as a women's advisor to government. And she's in the room today, and I do think we should recognise Elizabeth Reid-AO. I'm going to come back to why the time thing matters by the end of this. I've been scribbling everywhere, so I'm going to apologise when this gets a little bit ratty, but we've all heard some pretty amazing things tonight. Thank you to these panellists. I don't know how often we get a panel of men that could speak as brilliantly and eloquently and deeply as the conversations that we've had tonight. I know that they would probably think they could because that's one of the features, but to have such amazing women step forward, to have this conversation, to do the work that they do and to share the work that they do is really just to have that wisdom and that courage and that honesty in the room has been incredible. But also thank you very much for being here, for listening, for questioning and for being part of the next 25 years and being part of this conversation, caring so deeply, because we've been reminded of something quite powerful. Peace isn't the absence of conflict, that it's not so simple as that. That it has to be grounded in the presence of justice. It has to have inclusion. It has to have the everyday dignity of people and communities. We've heard how women's leadership changes the shape of peace, bringing creativity, bringing resilience and solutions that are rooted in the needs of people on the ground, people whose lived experience is in that space. We've heard about how women's voices transform those conversations, transform that language, and how communities thrive when we hear them, and how lasting peace depends on ensuring that all of those impacted voices, all of those impacted lives are actually heard. It is 25 years since 1325, and it may feel like we haven't come very far, but we have made significant progress. There is progress there, but whilst that progress is real, it is incomplete. And you've heard from a number of speakers today how almost 1 in 5 of the world's female population live within 50 kilometres of armed conflict. 1 in 5, and look around you, 1 in 5. That is a terrifying statistic. We've heard a lot about the high rates of conflict-related sexual violence, and we do know that we've got in Canberra next week, in fact, Judge Navi Pillay, who was a phenomenal woman who, during her time and working in Rwanda post the conflict there, was the person who managed to achieve that definition that rape was actually a war crime, that rape was a crime. That was a fundamental step in understanding the impact of conflict on women. We know about the climate-related crises and the disasters that disproportionately affect women and girls and gender-diverse individuals, making existing inequalities even worse. And so when disasters strike, we know that women are much less likely to survive. And when you start compounding that with women with diverse communities, women with disability, marginalised communities, minority communities, that gets worse and worse and worse. Sorry, I've got so many scribbled notes here, I'm going to get really messy. We know that peace and security delivers and means different things to different people, whether it's the peace and security that Lillian is working with in her work in Myanmar, whether it is the peace and security of surviving day by day and being able to feed your children and know that your children are safe through the Pacific, whether it be the day-by-day survival of people for whom the change of climate and the impact on their communities isn't a far-away thing, it's a daily lived experience. When we've heard a lot of the conversation tonight, there's been a lot of work around language. And I've been a firm believer, and I note the comments on language before, that language helps us shape our thinking. It helps us shape our reality and understand things. And the fact that it's taken so long to understand the language of conflict and the language of conflict around women in particular speaks to the work that we still have to do, but the way that it changes things. Lillian spoke of having women and young people and community leaders who've had to find that language in their own space and then find a place for their voices to be heard. And that when they are heard, when they named up their lived experience, that they do get a changed outcome. And we've seen that particularly, I think, in when we talk about having women at the room. And Ludmilla from WPS, Women, Peace and Security, is here today from civil society. And she was very clear on my very first meeting with her, I think it might have been the first day of my job, that it isn't just about women being at the table. And it's a little bit more about women belonging at the table and a lot more about women being heard at the table. And we've heard from all of our speakers today that when that is the case, then we get a completely different outcome. Sharon spoke about how you have to take that engagement and that participation and the need to hear different voices, and her work particularly with young women and trying to develop that cohort of young women across the Pacific to build and to grow and to become those voices in civil society, in organisations, hopefully all in Parliament one day, Sharon, which will make it much easier. We do have a campaign for Sharon to be president in 2030. Yeah, we're going to make some T-shirts if anyone's keen, so that might make it a little bit better. But she talked about the fact of what justice looks like in that circumstance, what justice looks like when you start to talk to people about it in a different way, in a way that is layered, in a way that is diverse, in a way that isn't siloed. And it is hard for government organisations to understand non-siloed approaches. It's really very hard because that's the way governments have historically operated. To be fair, it's the way universities operate as well. Silos are a bit of a thing, but the work that we're doing on the International Strategy for Gender Equality is about how do we break down some of those silos in our thinking and our engagement. We've got a bit to do in that. And Emily talked about that, about the fact that we're standing on the precipice and where do we go. And Sue talked about the crisis point that we're at in the environment, for instance, and the fact that we don't always think about the crisis in the way that the environment crisis might be playing out. That issue of child marriage, that issue of forced marriage, which is an issue when families can't survive because of the impact economically of a climate crisis that they're living with. It's the impact through Southeast Asia. It's the impact particularly in Myanmar, where there is no other option for families. And it is not an act of a lack of love. It is not an act of culture or a normal society expectation. It becomes an act of desperation. And that's something that we need to understand a lot more if we're going to provide the right level of support. All of this talked about whether or not we are now at that point of what do we do. So there was a discussion and some commentary around your question around what happens when our friends leave the room, what happens when all of those people who have been part of this fight, who've been part of supporting all of the UN work that we've done, suddenly aren't in the room anymore. And what do we do then? And it's that wonderful thing about, isn't it wonderful that we've got all of these wonderful things for women, but if it's merely privilege extended because it's a time that suits you, then we haven't actually achieved it. We've got a very long way to go. But what we do have to do in the times when some of our friends leave the room, as they have, is find new friends, find new allies and build those. And that work is happening. And it's actually interesting to see the countries that are stepping up into a place that they didn't think they needed to be because big players were already there. And in the absence of some of those big players, we are seeing some really interesting new faces come to the fore. And I think we have to build on that and keep working, because this isn't a time to go silent. It's not a time to step back. This is a time to make our voices louder, to be much stronger, and we really have to do that. And I think that when I've been listening to the comments of our Prime Minister and our Minister of Foreign Affairs in Unga, they were about saying we will stay true to the values and we will have that conversation. I hope that gives some confidence, hope to where we go. But as we close the conversation tonight, we do have to carry forward the insights and the commitment that have already been shared in this room and leave a bit more determined to do some things. We have to listen more closely to women and their lived experience on the front lines. We have to act to remove the barriers that block women's participation, and we have to invest in ideas and the people who make peace and security possible. They're small choices. If they're sustained over time, they create lasting change, because we know that when women lead, peace lasts. We know when women participate, our communities are stronger. We know when women are safe and empowered, we all benefit, not just women, the entire society benefits. So we have to commit together to amplify women's voices, protect rights, support leadership, build safer, more resilient communities for everyone, because that's the promise of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And it has to be a promise that we can fulfil, one that's intersectional, one that is forward-looking, one that changes us. So thanks again to our inspiring panellists. We do have to get this conversation going. I'm going to finish with one more I like a little bit of audience participation. It's been 25 years since 1325, 30 years since Beijing. Hands up if you are under 30 or 25. Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. 25, 30 years ago, I used to go to all these women's rallies. I'm an old women's sexual reproductive health rights activist from a long way back. And always at the rally, and I apologise for the language for those people who may be offended, there was always this tiny, wizened, furious old grey-haired woman with a sign saying, "I can't believe I'm still protesting this shit." Fast forward to now, I am that little wizened old grey-haired woman, and that is not a good thing to be, that I am not that. So don't let me be your future. Don't let you find yourself in 25 to 30 years going, I am now that wizened grey-haired old woman being angry, because this is your future. This is your chance to make good on the promise and the hope of Beijing 30 and Resolution 1325. This is actually the time we need you to step forward. So go forth, do good things, because our future is relying on you.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for being here. We so appreciate it tonight. Thanks again, everyone.